We live on an incredibly diverse planet. From the depths of the oceans to the harshest deserts, our planet teems with life. Humans first emerged somewhere in Africa at least 300,000 years ago. If those 300,000 years were compressed into a day, then my own life represents just the last 15 seconds before midnight. For almost all of our time walking the earth, humans have been just one of millions of species, a tiny population that has lived more or less at one with nature. 3,000 years ago, the human population of the earth was about 50 million people. In the next 1,000 years, it roughly tripled to 170 million in 1 AD. It took another 1,600 years to triple again, and by about 1,800, the human population had reached 1 billion people. By 1927, we'd reached 2 billion people. Since then, our population has quadrupled and the conflict between man and nature intensified. On land, habitat is being destroyed more rapidly than ever before. As the UN reported last year, over 1 million species are now threatened with extinction. Our seas have been dramatically overfished, and human waste is swilling through our rivers and accumulating in our food chains. In our atmosphere, carbon dioxide levels are higher than they have been for at least 800,000 years. As a result, from the world's most populous cities to the Australian outback, we're experiencing unprecedented extremes of weather. So too is every other species on the planet, from the polar bears in the Arctic to Africa's wildlife. Although many have become richer in monetary terms, the stresses of our modern lives have taken their toll too, with something like 1 billion people struggling with some form of mental health issue. All this should surely teach us that it is time to rethink how mankind lives in the world, to rethink our relationship with nature, to think about where and how frictions are growing between people and wildlife, and what we can learn from people who manage to live without conflict with nature. To think about the importance of wildlife organizations and educators and what we can each do right now to support them. To think about the opportunities there are for businesses and investors who get this right, to contribute more to society, to reduce their own risks, and to build more sustainable businesses. Many of us derive huge joy from the natural environment, whether it's feeling soft grass beneath your feet or looking out over a beautiful coastline, or the smell of rain in a desert, or the taste of fresh citrus fruit, or the sounds of the jungle. Our natural environment is food for our hearts and minds and souls. 60 years ago, this 14th July, the British primatologist and anthropologist Dame Jane Goodall arrived for the first time in what is now Gombe Stream National Park, Tanzania, and began studying the social and family interactions of wild chimpanzees, the closest species to humans in the animal kingdom. Her work needs no introduction. We are both thrilled and honored that she will open this very special episode of ESGX Live, Survival Instinct, Rethinking Our Relationship with Nature, with a special address. This episode is going to focus particularly on Africa. When Jane arrived there in the early 1960s, Africans made up about 10% of the world's population. Today, about 1 in 6 humans live in Africa. Over the next 30 years, its population is expected nearly to double, and Africa will account for almost all the expected population increase in the world between now and 2100. This may sound like a long time in the future, but we should expect our children and grandchildren to live to see that date. So we are delighted that Kaddu Sebunya, CEO of the African Wildlife Foundation, will join us in conversation with Cassandra Kelly. We'll also be joined by Shivani Bala, founder of the Waso Lions. Amy Vitale from National Geographic, Shifra Goldenberg from San Diego Zoo Global, Andrea Athanas from African Wildlife Foundation, and Sean Sugarman from Elephant Cooperation.
An organization like AWF that has been in Africa for more than almost 60 years now, we've seen the progress happening on the continent. The question we're trying to answer is, how do we negotiate space for the species in a modernizing Africa?
As always, this episode of ESGX Live is free and open to all, and it will be as interactive as we, and indeed you, can make it. As we count down to the hour, please take a moment to introduce yourself and your interests using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any friends who want to join us at the last minute, we will be simulcasting via YouTube at live.esgx.org. So from me, Nigel Lake in New York, my co-host Paul Herman in San Francisco, and our special guest host today, Cassandra Kelly, thank you very much for joining us. Also, a sincere thank you to Doug Heskey, who has been instrumental in bringing together this event, and of course the Jane Goodall Institute, the African Wildlife Foundation, San Diego Zoo Global, Amy Vitale, and Elephant Cooperation, as well as our sponsors, Pottinger, HIP Investor, and New Day Impact Investing, for helping to bring together this fantastic event. Welcome to ESGX Live, the global community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action to help build more resilient economies, more inclusive societies, and a better world. This week, to mark World Chimpanzee Day, we are taking you on a journey to Africa to explore how we can rethink our relationship with nature. Coming up, we have Kaddu Sebunya, CEO of the African Wildlife Foundation, in conversation with Cassandra Kelly. And after that, we'll have an interactive discussion with our special guest, Shivani Bala, from the founder of Iwaso Lions, Amy Vitale from National Geographic, Shifra Goldenberg from San Diego Zoo Global, Andrea Athanas, also from the African Wildlife Foundation, and Sean Sugarman from Elephant Cooperation. So who better to start us on this journey than Jane Goodall, the British primatologist and anthropologist who joins us from her home in England. 60 years ago, this 14th July just passed. In fact, today, if you're still in the Western Hemisphere where we are, Jane arrived for the first time in what is now Gombe Stream National Park, Tanzania, to begin her study of the social and family interactions of wild chimpanzees, the closest species to humans in the animal kingdom. So let me hand over now to Jane to share with us a little of what she has learned over the last 60 years.
Hello. The first thing I want to do is to thank New Day, ESGX, and all the impact investors who are helping the Jane Goodall Institute and other NGOs. And I have to say that investing in the conservation of the environment and conservation education has never been more important than it is now. Today is World Chimpanzee Day. So how sad to have to report that right across Africa, chimpanzee numbers are going as their forests are destroyed, as they're hunted for bushmeat or for the live animal trade, where mothers are shot to send babies off to be sold in other countries as pets for entertainment, and so on. And as people invade their habitat, taking with them their cattle and also their diseases. And it's not just chimpanzees who are becoming increasingly endangered. It's animals all around the world. In fact, we're in the midst of the 6th great extinction, and animal and plant species are vanishing at a faster rate than ever before, and it's caused by us. It's caused by our disrespect of the natural world. And it's this disrespect of the natural world, the way that we're polluting air, water, and land, our reckless burning of fossil fuels, our pollution of the ocean, our use of plastic bags. I could go on, but it's that disrespect of the planet that's caused climate change. And I'll come back to that in a minute. It's our disrespect of the environment and animals that has led to this current pandemic, because as we destroy forests and other habitats, animals get pushed into closer contact with people. For example, crop raiding, as we take away the animals' natural food, moving into cities in search of food, very often junk food. And this is giving an opportunity for a pathogen, a virus, bacteria, and so on, to spill over from one animal to one person, and that may bond with a cell or something in the human body, and it may lead to a new disease. And that disease may be contagious to other people. And it's our disrespect of animals that has really intensified the frequency with which these so-called zoonotic diseases spill over from animals to people. In the wild, we hunt them, kill them, eat them, and we traffic them so that animals are sent alive, or their body parts, to different parts of the world. In Asia, you get the wild animal markets. Many of them are there to sell for meat, others for pets. Species from around the region or even from other parts of the world crammed together in really unhygienic and incredibly cruel conditions. So there's a lot of stress. And animals may be killed on the spot for a buyer. The buyer and the seller may be contaminated with blood, urine, feces. And this can, again, lead to the perfect environment for, in this case, a virus to spill over into a person, bond with that cell, and create a new disease, COVID-19. And COVID-19 turns out to be highly contagious. So that woman, at least it's thought to have begun in one of these animal markets, wild animal markets in China, has traveled fast around the world and led to untold suffering, people dying, people losing their loved ones, people losing their jobs, those out on the front line, doctors, nurses, caregivers, suppliers, risking and losing their lives to make things better for other people. And it's also disrupted, sometimes very severely, economies around the world. There are people who depend on getting money each day from selling little things by the side of the road. And because they've been in shutdown, they've lost their livelihood and they're starving in some cases. So COVID-19 has really, really harmed us. It's by no means the first such zoonotic disease. SARS also began in a wildlife market in China. And MERS was transmitted to a person from a domestic camel in the Middle East. HIV resulted from one of the bush markets in Central Africa, actually 2 different bush markets in bushmeat markets. And HIV, as we all know, has wrought absolute havoc and caused millions of deaths around the world, and it still hasn't been eradicated. So we also have to consider the fact that our factory farms, these intensive animal agricultural, really horror houses where animals are bred for food. And this again has created, particularly in the slaughterhouses, conditions where a bacteria or a virus has jumped from an animal to a person and led to many of the zoonotic.
Test.
up at the stars in the night sky and seeing them shining brightly and not through a layer of pollution, or even not at all because the pollution is so bad. I've been in cities like that. Will there be a groundswell of people so anxious not to return to those polluted days that eventually big business and government will listen? I hope so. Because if we carry on like this, it spells disaster for the natural world, and that includes us, because we are part of the natural world. We depend on it for everything. And so, although many governments and businesses today are just raring to get back to business as usual because of the economy, if we can just work out a new green economy, because business as usual will literally cause our downfall. Not just the natural world. We're part of it. I repeat that. We're part of it. And in order for this new world to happen, which it must, and I really hope and believe it can, we have to alleviate poverty, because if you're really poor, you're going to destroy the environment because you want to grow more food to feed your family, because you must. Fish the last fish because you want to feed your family, because you must. Buy the cheapest junk food in the city. You can't afford to ask, how was it made? Did it harm the environment? Was it cruel to animals? Is it cheap because of child slavery, or because the people making it were paid less than a smaller wage than they should be, sometimes a wage that you really can't live on? They buy the cheapest because they must. And so we have to alleviate poverty. We have to do something about the unsustainable lifestyles of most of us. I have more than I need, much more than I need. I try to leave a light ecological footprint every day, but I could do better. And some people have way, way, way too much stuff. You know, who needs all these houses and several yachts and things like that? We just have to think what Mahatma Gandhi said: this planet can provide for human need, but not human greed. We have to try and make decisions in our daily lives that will ask about the consequences for future generations. Do we care about our grandchildren, great-grandchildren and theirs? Of course we do. So we really need to think about the consequences of what we do each day. And to think that we can have unlimited economic development on a planet with finite natural resources doesn't make sense, especially when there's a growing human population. 7.2 billion of us now, estimated to be 9.7 billion, nearly 10 billion in 2050. Already we're using up natural resources in some places faster than the planet can, faster than nature can replenish them. So we have to think of a new way of interacting with the environment, a new way of living, a new green economy. For today, Jane Goodall Institute should be celebrating, and we are, but you know, it's the 60th anniversary of the day when I first arrived in the Gombe National Park to begin the study of the chimpanzees there, which is carrying on today. And we're still learning new things about these amazing beings. And it's because chimpanzees are biologically so like us. We share 98.6 of our DNA with them. And in behavior, they're nonverbal communication, kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another, holding out the hand, begging for food, watching the close relationship between a mother and her growing child, between the brothers and sisters, family relations that can last through a life of up to 60 years. And we have learned so much from these chimpanzees about who we are, what makes us different, the most different, when we're similar in so many ways. The fact, I think, that at some point in our evolution, we developed a spoken language. And I believe that has triggered this explosive development of our intellect. That's what makes us most different. We're quite definitely the most intellectual species that's ever walked the planet. Yes, animals are way more intelligent than we used to think, and they share our emotions and they have personalities. But just think, we designed a rocket that went up to Mars, a little robot crawled off, has been taking photographs of the surface of Mars. At one time, we thought life might be sustained, our kind of life on Mars. We know now that's not true. We've got this one beautiful green and blue planet Earth. How come this intellectual species is destroying it? Is there perhaps a disconnect between the clever brain and the human heart, love and compassion? And I truly believe only when head and heart work in harmony can we attain our true human potential. So this COVID pandemic has really highlighted the need for support for conservation efforts around the planet. One byproduct is the fact that it's not been possible in many places to pay rangers to protect protected areas. And that's already led to an increase in poaching, either from the cartels with elephant, ivory, and rhino horn, or just simple village people who no longer can make money from tourist operations, and so they've turned to poaching in order to survive. And a lot of the problems related to the environment and cruelty to animals come from a lack of knowledge. So environmental conservation and education, as I said at the beginning, has never been more important than now. So I want to end up by thanking all of you who've helped, because JGI will continue. We have to care for the chimpanzees across Africa, along with other organizations. And right now we're terrified that the chimpanzees will be affected by COVID-19. That's why it's difficult to really celebrate this amazing 60th anniversary. But we will celebrate because of what we learned from it, and because of what it's taught other people, and because it's helped us to understand what it means to be human. So thank you all very much. And let's work together for a better future, because there is hope. Hope in the young people, in our Roots and Shoots program and others for young people, where the main message is every one of us makes an impact every single day, and we get to choose what kind of impact we make. And everywhere I go, there are young people wanting to tell Dr. Jane what they've been doing to help people, to help animals, to help the environment, and how they've been learning that it doesn't matter about the color of our skin or our religion or our culture or what we eat or wear. It matters that we're human beings. And there's hundreds of thousands of groups in 65 countries, and all those who've been through the program when they were at school, and they hang on to those values throughout life. I know because they've told me, but probably not all of them, but many of them. There's hope in this brain. We're coming up with amazing innovations to help us live in greater harmony with nature. We're beginning to think about our own environmental footprints and what we can do better. The resilience of nature, places that we have destroyed utterly. Give them time and maybe some help, and once again they can support life. Animals on the brink of extinction can be and have been given another chance. And there's the indomitable human spirit. People who tackle what seems impossible won't give up and so often succeed. And then there's all of you who help to make so much possible and help us to think with more hope for a better future for our grandchildren and theirs. So thank you very much, and goodbye for now.
Well, there is plenty to digest in there. There were a couple of things that Jane said that I think really struck home for me. One is, we have this one beautiful blue-green planet. How come this intellectual species is destroying it? And she also said, to think we can have unlimited resources or unlimited economic development on a planet with only finite natural resources doesn't make sense, especially when there's a growing human population. So we must rethink our relationship with nature. And nowhere, of course, is all this more of a real and present challenge than in Africa. Over the next 30 years, Africa's population will roughly double in size, and its people will, of course, rightly expect significant economic and social development, creating huge pressure on man-made infrastructure and on the natural environment. So with that as an introduction, let me introduce to our fabulous host for today, Cassandra Kelly. Among other things, she's known for her work around the world, lifting up and empowering all sorts of people. She's a founding member of the EU's Global Tech Panel, chair of the Treasury Corporation of Victoria, a public speaker on diversity, technology and humanity, and she also has a particular love for Africa and for action. So Cassandra, please do join us now. Hopefully you are there and your video connection will come live. And she does all sorts of other things silently and unseen. So welcome, Cassandra, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I noticed a few people writing to me saying they had tears in their eyes. This is most unhelpful as a host in terms of the makeup and general look. So I'm pulling myself together. I have had the chance to see that before, and as Nigel mentioned in the chat, he will make sure that you get the version with the full sound after this, and it still moves me. But I want to, with that as backdrop and a deep call to our souls, a deep call to us as human beings sharing one planet. I want to keep that in my heart and keep that in my mind and invite you, Kaddu, please, to join me here on the virtual stage. You're calling in or dialing in, zooming in from Nairobi. In her message to us, she speaks of the 6th great extinction, where animal and plant species are vanishing at a faster rate than ever before. She lays fairly the responsibility squarely at our feet. And she noticed that it's our fundamental sort of disrespect, I guess, of the natural world, of animals, of our planet. And what I really feel strongly about is also our unhealthy definition of what it is to be successful. So I'm looking forward to discussing some of these issues with you today. I know we could do that as a session in of itself, so we won't be able to go everywhere. But before, when we talked earlier, Kaddu, and I said to you, Kaddu, why does this matter? You know, why does it matter to you? Why does it matter to us, our relationship to nature? And what's the urgency? As I'm fairly well regarded for the sense that I don't mind using the word urgent. I don't think we have time to muck around. And I think it's, you know, we need to get on with it now, and we should have been doing it yesterday. So tomorrow sounds like a really good time to start. So I'd love to invite you to help me understand why I sense, and in some part I know, and in a lot I'm still learning, why we need to get on with doing more than we do, and what can we do? But first, because it moved me, if you don't mind sharing how you came to care. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Cassandra. I'll join Jane to thank the organizers, ESGX and New Day, for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure addressing all of you who have managed to tune in. Where it all started, this was in a small village in Mashoro for me. It's a fishing village in Western Uganda, found in the middle of a national park. I was just fresh from UK, where I did my studies, and coming back to Uganda, where I come from. And this fishing village in middle of a national park, and seeing all wildlife like Jane described it, and seeing everybody in the village not really paying attention to how beautiful and the setup this area was. And right there, I noticed and realized that if we can't get people, if we can't get Africans to really pay attention to how beautiful this environment is, but they're chasing and their livelihoods, we are going to lose it all. And I've been so lucky to be leading an organization, African Wildlife Foundation, focused on building that African conservation constituency and leadership. It's a big part of our mission. You touched a number of things, and let me just give a few of my remarks that ran through some of the things Jane and you touched. I've thought about the challenges Africa faces managing wildlife. I reflected upon the kind of building blocks needed to chart a different trajectory and the need to change the way conservation is apparent on the continent. I'll just give you a background of what's going on in the continent. Since The Economist, this is a news magazine, regrettably labeled Africa a hopeless continent 2 decades ago, a profound change has taken hold. Africa is changing. Some say it's growth, some say it's developing, but we know not everything that grows develops, or anything that develops is growing. The decision, Jane echoed this, that Africa is making now for the development trajectory will determine the Africa we shall leave for the future generation. And it's all up to us. Globally speaking, we are all the first generation to witness a pre-COVID Africa where economic growth was averaging 4% in most countries. Foreign investments had begun tripling in many cases, and labor productivity was rising at approximately 2.7 annually. Because of COVID, now we are looking at an economic recession, the first on the continent. But despite all the negative impacts COVID-19 has presented, there are opportunities. Our generation again is now able to go back to the drawing board and rethink on practical solutions to sustainable development. And perhaps we might be the last generation to inform the next steps to avoid the worst impact of climate change. Because as Africa has developed, it's less widely reported or acknowledged that during the same period of that economic growth, Africa has experienced devastating losses of our unique wildlife. I'll give you a few examples. Just in 2005, 15 years ago, lions within the continent were approximately 50,000. The population is half now. Elephants, 1.3 million 30 years ago in 1970. And now they're around 450,000 and still dropping. Rhino subspecies has been declared extinct in the last 3 years. As a matter of fact, this has happened in my lifetime. This is happening against the backdrop where 17% of the world's 7.6 billion people already live in Africa today. And by the close of this century, half of all young people on the planet under the age of 18 will live in Africa. Finding land to grow food for this population, which we must do, building homes for them, constructing roads to transport, fuel to cook their food, will and already is putting unbearable pressure on natural resources. These realities challenge conservation, posing threats to nature as competition increases between people and wildlife for food and space. So ecologists and conservationists are not going to be successful without engaging the mindsets that are driving development on the continent. It's therefore pertinent to consider what ecological systems means to Africa's economic ambitions. I'll give you several forces that are at play in Africa driving this change. The region currently has the highest rate of urban population growth worldwide. A mushrooming middle class expected to grow from 355 million in 2010 to nearly 1.1 billion by 2060. This is going to drive competition for resources, food, energy, infrastructure required to support this explosion. The decision that people are making around population growth, agriculture investment, urbanization is what will determine the future space left for wildlife. We therefore need to understand that the problems surrounding wildlife management are inseparable and are linked to the complex dynamics of macro-sectoral issues underlying Africa's broad crisis of population, food, poverty, and land use. The biggest mistake we have done is viewing wildlife protection exclusively as an environmental concern. It's just a symptom of deeper underlying forces involving political, social, health, economic dynamics that are tied to development. COVID-19 has showed us how flat the world is. From a town in China, to the outskirts of Scotland, to Santa Cruz in California, to a small place in Mukono where I come from in Uganda, we are all in masks and social distancing. Africa's wildlife is at a crossroad, but the solution can only be enacted using coordinated global strategies and support. We need to work together. Jane understood that. At the beginning of my speech, I mentioned a cover page published by The Economist in 2000. That evolved into Africa Rising cover after 10 years in 2011. And then Africa Aspiring 2 years later. We have the power, I believe, all of us, to drive the continent in the right direction. And you and I are the authors of the next cover headline on Africa. Let us start a lasting positive investment together. Thank you, Cassandra.
Kaddu, look, thank you very much indeed. You obviously had to cover quite a lot of ground there. I was wondering if we could take a chance just to dive in. So you obviously mentioned COVID obviously is a factor, and as my understanding is, certainly I know we'll hear from other panelists, it's made it more difficult. Can you tell me more about how it's changed the role of conservation in Africa?
COVID has brought, it's a crisis. It has impacted the way we do conservation in Africa in many ways, but there are some opportunities and outliers. COVID overnight shut down an industry that has supported conservation for many years, the tourism industry. It was like a switching of the bulb. Overnight, airports were closed, borders were closed. There were no flights. That night, most of the parks' revenue dropped to zero. Conservation tourism supports average of about 8% of revenue that supports protection and management of national parks. 100% of revenue for the private land owners that manage wildlife comes from this industry. But that's not all. That's not all. A lot of livelihoods. Here in Kenya, it's 3 million people that depend on this industry. We have seen a spike in poaching since COVID started, simply because of that revenue break. A lot of patrols are not being able to taken in the field, but also just the presence of tourists avails us more eyes as tourists drive around the parks. That deters poaching. The layoff of a lot of workers that have been running tourism industries, and some of them have been rangers in parks, there is a risk that they're going to end up into gangs being recruited just because of to put money, food on the table. And the risk is that they know more about wildlife, and if they're used by these gangs, that's going to have a lot of impact. But let me just talk about some of the opportunities. For the first time, I'm having different conversations with a lot of African governments right now. Because of the shutdown of the industry, there is a realization of how important tourism has been and how important, therefore, conservation has been. The zoonotic diseases, there is now a realization that actually our work in conservation, we are just not tree huggers, or we don't like development, but however, we are the firewalls of the zoonotic diseases. Our work now is seen that the more we do conservation of wildlands, the more we keep these zoonotic diseases on wildlife and in wildlands where they belong. So it's a different conversation we're having on the continent right now.
I'm getting some interesting questions. And just a reminder to everyone, please preferably put your questions in the Q&A function, not in the chat. There's a lot of chat goes on and I'm afraid I'll miss your question. So there's a Q&A button down the bottom and please feel free to put your question in there. But I've got one here from Robert and he's asking how's the UN reacting and the strategies and what's it doing about this wildlife situation given COVID? Is it making more noise? I know we've got the sustainable goals, but then COVID came along. So how is the UN assisting and or otherwise in your efforts?
UN has been very important because it's a body that we are partnering with actually here in Nairobi. UNEP is headquartered here in Nairobi. We are having conversations and has been very helpful working together in bringing African governments to start the conversation on the role of wildlife in Africa's economy. So building that platform has been very, very useful by the Africa Regional Office here by UNEP. But if you say UN in general, the data and statistics from the World Health Organization has been so important for us to determine some of the work and where we work and how the risk and the danger and what to do in some of these communities. Right now, as a conservation organization, our response has been to meet people where the pain is. We are now supplying health equipment in villages. We are paying people to cash to work so that we can sustain the economies of these rural communities that have been so much depending on either conservation enterprises or just craft networks, or just other value chains that are brought to them because of the wildlife economies that have been existing in their areas.
So can you give us another example, maybe tangible, of a solution or something that's working, some case study, just something that we can hold on to and maybe be inspired by and then use our minds to think laterally? Or, yeah, I just love to, what's working? Yeah. There's so much threat, there's so much here that is alarming as well. I'd love to have some hope.
No, I mean, it's amazing. Just here in Kenya, and we work in an area, those who are familiar in Kenya, in Masai Mara, the local communities there that own a big part of the land that tourism has been, and tourists have been enjoying the Mara, up and, joining in patrols of wildlife. They've allowed to take 50% of lease for their land, so because revenue has gone down. In Rwanda and Uganda, where we've been supporting community ownership of lodges, they've used the revenue from the tourism that they've got from tourism to do other businesses and support each other during this period, but also to sustain the protection of the mountain gorillas. In these countries. We've seen in Cameroon, where we work, where the women groups have repackaged some of the work they've been doing conserving forests, and now they're using forest products to additionally produce soap that communities are using to sanitize during the COVID crisis. There's a lot of hope. And actually, in one of the countries where we work, the communities, the tourism industry has really responded very well in this regard. Governments also are listening. We've seen here in East Africa an increase in funding from government budgets to support protected areas right now. But we are seeing some spikes as well. No, there's a number of good news coming out.
There's a question in here also that that's a really interesting one, and I actually did a thesis on something similar, and it's from I think it's from Hashititha. So thank you very much. He says in one interview, Raymond Bonner criticizes prioritizing wildlife conservation over poverty. He actually goes on to say that the solution to the former actually lies in solving poverty itself. What do you think?
Absolutely, that's right, but it's where the investments are. In all our work, actually, in terms of strategy, we invest, we challenge ourselves to invest $1 in a national park and $1 outside national parks. That addresses community livelihoods. You can, and in my opening remarks, really some of the solutions and the challenges of conservation now, and so not so much going to be addressed by increasing protection or by increasing management of wildlife, but instead they're going to be, we need to be addressing how agriculture is being done, because the competition for space is coming from food communities where they see the need for increasing food security. It's the communities in need for their livelihoods and government's growth of economy that is driving their priorities. So the more we address the pressure points that are coming from need for energy, need for livelihoods, need for education, need for health, that's where we see the drive for increased poaching, the drive for increased demand for habitat, as turning most of the protected areas into agricultural land, but also just the people losing their affiliations to nature because they have other demands. So addressing poverty is a big part of that. Education is a big part of that. We do have educational programs where we build schools to increase education so that less people depend on land, and we produce more people who are going to join the service industry. It's really about livelihoods now, less about protection, less about managing wildlife. As COVID-19 has taught us, actually, when you leave wildlife alone, it thrives. And it's thriving now with absence.
I couldn't agree more. I've seen all sorts of animals in the wild just within a city environment that it's been safer for them to come out. And as Dr. Goodall talks about, we can see stars, we can breathe cleaner air. The planet's going to be fine. It will adapt, whereas it may not look, it will not look as it does now as we continue, if we continue to destroy it like we are. However, the planet will actually survive. We won't be able to coexist with the planet. And that's why I keep trying to explain to people, yes, we'll destroy the planet, it won't look the same, but we won't even be here to appreciate or otherwise what we've done to it. So it's urgent, it's truly urgent. So thank you so much. Kaddu, I have got so many questions for you, and I'm sneakily trying to figure out whether there's a way that if I don't get to everyone's questions at the end, I could be so bold as to ask panelists and yourself to maybe contribute answers after the fact, because I'm terribly sorry that the questions, they've taken it very seriously and the questions are excellent. But at this point in time, I'm going to ask you to have a glass of water, sit back and enjoy, as you know, some of the other contributions that we've got today. And I'm going to ask that Amy join me on the stage. Thank you so much, Kaddu. That is food for thought. And if there's something that I took out of that for me, it is that Africa is an extraordinary continent, and the African people inspire me greatly. And we need people that are not living there need to think about the devastation we cause it through living not even in location, and some of the choices that we can make, some of the investments that we can make, some of the influence we can have with governments near and far to make better outcomes for such a vital part of the ecosystem for us all. So thank you for sharing those opening thoughts with us. Now, Amy, I don't even know what to say. I've been receiving some of your photos over the last few days, and they leave me breathless. We all know that the power of images and are incredible in terms of increasing awareness and generating interest and educating people by putting a face, I guess, on the issue. And indeed, you put the face on issues, including on the National Geographic, among others. And that's still a staple in our household every month, and excited to meet you. And you have the opportunity, I guess, to make it real through photos and storytelling. And we spoke last night about this again, and the story that you want to tell. And I'm intrigued and excited to see from the conversations we've had lately, what messages you want to share with us today and what it is that we're going to make that mean. So I'm going to hand the floor to you, and I'm buckling in for what I'm sure will be really, truly powerful, as I personally am sitting here searching for my own clarity as to how I'm linked to wildlife and what my own personal responsibility and relationship is to nature. So Amy, with no further ado, please, as they say, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all. I'm truly humbled to be here with all of you. And I just want to start by saying that I'm just a messenger. I mean, the pictures are really a reflection of the incredible people and stories. And I think those stories matter right now more than ever, because we need to know what the challenges are, but we also are desperate for the way forward. What do we all do? And I think it's already been mentioned in many ways today. Kaddu, thank you so much. Jane, thank you. I think you already articulated it very, very well, which is, the solutions are in people. We have the capacity to be the greatest destroyers or the greatest protectors, and the future is up to us. And I think that right now, nature has sent us this really powerful message that just reminds us of how small and deeply interconnected our world really is. It's this moment to breathe. I feel like all the things happening that we're all so connected, and there's metaphors just about breathing as humanity, as we treat one another, but globally and with the planet as well. So these unsettling times are also a firm wake-up call and a powerful reminder that our human well-being is linked to the biodiversity and health of this planet. And so I just want to first thank everybody that I'm speaking with, because you guys are the real heroes. You are the ones on the front lines doing the real work. I'm just going to share a couple of stories very quickly about how I became involved in all of this and really changed my trajectory of my own work, realizing that this is the most important story out there today. And I'm calling this Wild Hope because Jane said it, Kaddu said it, there is hope. And I think we have to focus on that to find our way forward. But I began my story, I was actually always covering stories of, humanity, issues of social justice, poverty, and conflict, war, all of these things, which are, I think we all understand, absolutely connected to wildlife and biodiversity. All these stories are one and the same, but it took meeting these rhinos for me to have my own personal wake-up call. And I heard about a story 10 years ago about this move. They were moving 4 rhinos from a zoo in the Czech Republic back to Kenya, in this last-ditch effort to save an entire species. And at the time, there were only 8 of them alive, all living in zoos. 2 were in San Diego, and 6 of them were at the Dvůr Králové Zoo in the Czech Republic, living in this, it was December, cold, snowy December day in 2009. And this is how we imagine wildlife roaming the open plains of Africa, right? These are the images we're given, but this is what it actually looks like today. And it just, something about meeting this ancient hulking creature stopped me in my tracks, left me breathless, and I knew looking at these beautiful creatures that I was witnessing extinction. This is what it looks like, right? That I knew that perhaps this animal, if it didn't work, this effort to bring them back to Africa to, hopefully get them to breed again, but that, I was witnessing really our own demise. And I felt this deep connection to all of, I just suddenly understood that this isn't a story just about rhinos, although they are majestic and beautiful and ancient, but that it was something more. And I'm sorry to show such a horrific image, but it's not just about rhinos. I mean, it's about all of these species and even lesser known species that we don't even talk about. And as I started to dive into this story and really want to understand what was happening, what were the ways forward, I realized it was always being told in this narrative of we have to militarize, we have to fight those poachers. And I just kept asking myself, like, well, what do the people living with the wildlife think? Because I never found stories 10, 11 years ago about the indigenous people living with the wild. I just felt like that piece of the story was being left out. So I began to explore this and found incredible stories of hope that will just bring tears to your eyes, that make you want to jump out of bed and tell their stories because they're so incredible. You know, this is Kamara, who's sleeping with 3 orphaned black rhinos, a different species than the northern white rhino. But, you know, these people are so amazing. They literally make me cry every time I think about them. They've committed their lives to protecting these creatures. They're the unsung heroes. And I think that, you know, we have choices today. We can go, these are actually a group of Samburu warriors meeting orphan black rhinos for the first time because they had a dream to bring rhinos back to their own landscape where they had been locally extinct for almost 30 years. And their dream came true. They did bring these rhinos back, and I'm happy to tell you it's called Sarah Wildlife Conservancy, and I believe they've already had 6 babies born from the rhinos that they brought there. And, you know, there are these stories of hope, of connectedness that remind us, you know, the future's in our hands. We get to decide what happens next. And I think so much of it is empowering these communities. This is Kamara, and I hope I didn't say Kamaro in the last picture. That was Yusuf sleeping with the baby black rhinos. This is Kamara at Lewa Wildlife Conservancy, also with another orphan black rhino. But, you know, something about meeting these men and women just stopped me in my tracks, and I just felt like we need to shine a light on some of the stories. And you'll hear later from, you know, some other people that are on the ground in these same communities doing so much. But I want to flash back to a really heartbreaking moment in March of 2018. And my friends at Old Pejeta Conservancy called me and said, hurry, Sudan, who was the last male northern white rhino, he lived a long life, but he was about to die. And I arrived, and these were literally the final moments. And this is Jojo going to give Sudan, you know, his last goodbye. And he leaned in, and Sudan leaned his heavy head into Jojo's head. And, you know, I just feel like this image symbolizes this message that we're all talking about right now, which is, you know, you see in this image, you see, again, that we brought these rhinos to their fate, and that we also are the greatest protectors if we choose that route. But that somehow this image reminds me of our own demise. Like we have this amazing wake-up call right now, and what are we going to all choose to do? And I think even this pandemic is another powerful reminder, because it does show us, as Jane already said, that, you know, the reason we're having these pandemics is because you know, of them jumping into, you know, from wildlife into humans. So these viruses. So this is our chance. But you know, I also want to just recognize that there's only 2 female northern white rhinos alive on the planet right now at Old Pejeta Wildlife Conservancy. And in this beautiful twist of fate, the Biorescue Project is actually trying to use science now to revive this species. And whether it works for the rhino, this science is very valuable, important for other species. But hopefully we can do more right now, reprioritize. And then I just want to quickly, you know, I have to rush through this, but I want to share one more story from the same region in northern Kenya where there is hope. You know, this is another Samburu community up in Namanyak Wildlife Conservancy, who, you know, 25 years ago, the wildlife had been poached, And as a result, people were suffering too. And, you start to understand when you take one keystone species out, like elephants, the whole ecosystem suffers, including people. And against all odds, this community started an elephant sanctuary called Riteti Elephant Sanctuary. And they are performing a minor miracle. It's really a beautiful, beautiful story where they went from once fearing elephants to becoming their greatest protectors. And I encourage everybody to go up and, support and visit, even if you can't visit personally, but like just visit virtually and support these communities who are finding alternatives. That's the thing. And also our tourism dollars do matter. When we are able to travel, do your homework, find out the places where communities receive the benefits of protecting wildlife. It gives them incentive. And then the other piece of the story, which I love, this is Mary with one of the first babies that had arrived when it first opened, called Suyan. And they are one of the first elephant sanctuaries that hires Indigenous women to be elephant keepers. And that is big. That definitely changes a lot of things. And I just want to say this story is just evolved. They're going on their 4th anniversary, and it's evolved so much. It's been a beautiful journey to watch their relationships. And I feel like it's not just a story about elephants, it's a story about all of us. It's about how we relate to one another, how we relate to wildlife. And, I do just want to kind of wrap up with a couple of key messages here to say that, first we should shine a light on those that are caring for the environment. And we must treat one another, all humans, with empathy, because there is room enough for all of us. It is about our priorities and how we choose to use our resources. But yes, the challenges are formidable, but there's no time in human history when there's been greater awareness and opportunity for transformation. People are smart. We can figure this out if we make this our priority. And then my final image is this Lekupanai, an orphan giraffe that went back to the wild. And interestingly, those giraffe will come back to come and check in on Lekupanai. It's a beautiful story to witness. But all of our actions today are going to determine our future for generations after us. Let's not condemn future generations to eternal poverty, right? And my final message is that nature is resilient if we give it a chance. And all of us can be messengers. Every single person tuned in here today is a messenger. And it's important that all of us get involved. Our politicians matter, so voting, and that matters, but the messenger matters as much as the message itself. So become a messenger. And that's it. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the share here.
Well, Amy, while you're doing that, it is up to all of us, and that is a very powerful final message. The chat has been going wild, to use a pun, and you have got questions in the Q&A box, which I might ask you at some point when you get a moment to turn to when you're having some downtime, and see if you can just answer them, maybe type them in there, just because we don't have the time to answer all of them. Same to all the panelists. And thank you. The questions are flowing in the Q&A, and the appreciative and grateful audience. What a marvelous people you are. There is one question I do want to ask, because I feel it is it's in the chat, and it's a very touching question from someone who I feel is looking to you for a bit of inspiration. So I know that this is a personal message, I suspect, to someone who is a photographer. Leslie, I don't know if you are, but I'm guessing. I'm inspired by your work. How can photographers have the biggest impact? Obviously the storytelling I'm suggesting, but is social media the most powerful vehicle?
Well, yes. I mean, I have been so moved by the power of that. you know, I'm so privileged to have the platform of National Geographic, but but I didn't always have that platform. And I've been so profoundly surprised by social media, and that, you know, I have so many people that have, you know, really take a hold of this, and they start telling stories in their own backyard of the nature right there next to them. I have a woman I talk to regularly in Los Angeles. In her backyard, she started an Instagram account called The Daily Janes, which is just chronicling the nature in her backyard. And I think those, you know, we can't ever forget the power of the stories right here, and that they're all around us. So yes, using social media, connecting to, you know, the people you admire, because it's all about sharing these stories and giving us all, sharing and showing that interconnectedness matters.
Yeah, that's very, very important. The collaboration, the interconnectedness, and in finding the other people that you can, that nourish you. I suspect at times when it can be pretty hard going and pretty defeating at times to see some of the devastation, but to remind you that there is this hope you've been talking about. So thank you so very much. And I'm going to ask Amy for you to get there in the Q&A and start answering some of the people who've had questions for you. And ask thank you so much. And we'll keep you there, and we'll ask the other panelists to join us. And you all seem to have the hang of the chat, so that's really fantastic. And just for those of you who like statistics, this is probably one of the best attended events, which goes to show, and there was a question in the Q&A saying, you know, you're sort of speaking to the interested, what happens to the people that aren't? And I guess that's something that we can do. We can go out and spread the message. So sometimes some people just don't hear about it. It hasn't touched them. They haven't been able to afford to go. It's not a channel they've tuned into. It's not that they're not interested. No one has found a way to serve them the message in a way that they can hear it and then become engaged in the discussion. So please, let's all make that something that we can easily do. I'm just going to check that I am hopefully got my panelists now on stage, and I'm going to start with Shivani. So Shivani, are you there?
Hi, Cassandra. Aha. Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. For the audience, I've already offered a timeshare to Shivani for her tent there in Kenya. Shivani works on the ground with Owasso lions. We heard about what's happened to the lion population. Absolutely devastating. What a magnificent animal. I've spent time there watching with people I care deeply about. And, you know, you're working hand in hand with the local communities who share their land with lions and other wildlife. And from memory, you were explaining to me that one of the most important ways to maintain sort of the population, the breeding, and ensure connectivity within and beyond the Samburu landscape is to really, for us to truly understand what is coexistence. So I would love it if you could share with me, you know, I can look it up. I think I know what it means, but do I really? So what is coexistence? Is it new or a novel concept? It sounds like it's been around for a while. And what are the lessons that you're going to share with us, because you're there on the ground every day? I'm so keen to hear. So please do share. Thank you, Shivani.
Thank you, Cassandra, and thank you, New Day and ESGX, for inviting me. It's just fantastic to be here with everyone. So, Cassandra, coexistence is not something new. Conservation communities across Africa have coexisted with wildlife for generations, and I'm very lucky and privileged to work with the Samburu communities in northern Kenya. But far often, conservation is looked at as something that is brought to communities, that it's something that they must do and they need to be taught. For me, conservation and coexistence is about ownership. And when I moved here to Samburu about 20 years ago, I was born and raised in Nairobi. And so this was very new for me, but I never came here expecting to hand over conservation to the Samburu communities. What I did was I came to learn, and I still feel almost 20 years later, I'm still learning. And I came to work with my team, my amazing team, this incredible community, to continue to promote coexistence. And the narrative of bringing conservation to local communities needs to change to become one about local communities and local people being the key decision makers. And I have a great story to tell you about some very powerful women that we work with here. So I'd been working with warriors and men and children for many years. And in 2013, I had some very demanding, loud ladies coming and marching into our camp saying, Shivani, involve us in conservation because we can do it. We can do lion conservation as much as any of the people you're working with. And most importantly, they said, wildlife belongs to us anyway. And this is where traditional values and culture is so important. And for me, that is also what coexistence is about. And so this group of ladies formed their own program. It's called the Mama Simba program. And that means Mother of Lions. And they came together to see how can they protect lions in this area. And they have full ownership over this program. It wasn't me telling them, this is how Mama Simba should be run. And this amazing lady you see in your screen here, named Paris Roy, and she's the coordinator of the Mama Simba program. And she's always had a voice. She's now feels courageous and feels empowered to use it. And when Paris Roy speaks, people listen. She stands up in any community meeting and she'll talk about lions, she'll talk about village, she'll talk about livestock, she'll talk about the drought, and everyone is listening to her. In this picture here, she was addressing a group of 400 community members. And trust me, she didn't stop talking and no one stopped listening. So it's an example of what can happen when communities are the key decision makers and have full ownership over something. Coexistence for me is also about continuation over generations. And, you know, we've heard a lot about hope and the youth from Kaddu, from Jane Goodall, from Amy. And there's another great story I want to tell you of a young boy who's actually not so young anymore. His name is Junior. And Junior was only 9 years old. And in this picture you can see here, he was 9 years old and he came to spend 5 days with us at our Lion Kids Camp. And he got so excited about conservation that at the end of the kids camp, he said, I want to do just what Generia does. Generia is pictured there with him. And he said, I want to be a lion conservationist. I can't wait to be a warrior. And I'm going to spend every holiday and every weekend with you. And I thought, oh, surely this kid's not serious. Well, I should have taken him seriously because Junior became a conservationist that day. It's not about him being the next generation of conservationists. He became a conservationist at the end of that Lion Kids Camp. And of course, he spent every weekend with us since. He has spent every holiday with us since. And a very key moment happened for him last month. He became a warrior. And so in the picture you saw before, there he was, Generia, looking down at, 9-year-old Junior. And now in this next picture, you can see Junior towering above Generia because he is now a warrior and Generia is now an elder. And what has happened is we've come full circle. We've had children who've become warriors, who've always been excited about conservation and now are being given a chance. So, these are just a couple of stories about what coexistence is to me. But the reality is, Cassandra, is coexistence is under threat. There's a lot of challenges that are now causing more friction between people and wildlife. Loss of culture is a big one. And I unfortunately see it in so many parts of the country now, including here. Lack of prey. I mean, lions and other wild carnivores just don't have enough food. There's so much land degradation. And we're very fortunate to have some amazing partners here who focus on restoring the lands. Wildlife is also, what I have seen recently over the last couple of years, I feel like wildlife is now a commodity, and it's not something I grew up seeing. I was born going on safari with my parents, and what I feel now is wildlife has been made such a commodity that it's become less meaningful to the people. And this is a great risk, especially now at a time like COVID, when there's no tourism dollars coming in and people's tolerance levels are far lower than what they normally are. So I believe those are a few of the threats affecting coexistence. But there is one that not a lot of people talk about, and that is one of the lack of inclusivity, the lack of diversity, and the imbalance in leadership when it comes to who is making decisions about conservation and coexistence. And I think this causes more friction between people and wildlife. There's less than 5% women leaders in conservation in Africa. And this has to change. We have got to come out of this lack of this lack of inclusion, this lack of diversity, this colonial environment that has plagued Africa for so long. We've got to come out of it. And the good news is there are so many great initiatives addressing all these threats. There's an amazing initiative looking at women's leadership and trying to address that imbalance. It's called Women in the Environment. There are amazing efforts to restore the rangelands. For example, what the Grevi Zebra Trust, our great partners, do here in Northern Kenya with the Northern Rangelands Trust that Amy mentioned. So the solutions are there. And what we must all do is come together, be messengers, as Amy said, be allies, and talk about these really important nuances in conservation. We've got to come together and discuss them so we can have a far more better balanced environment within Africa where the local people are the decision makers, they have ownership, and where there's sustainability in conservation. And so for me, those are some of what I have seen over the last 2 decades here in Samburu and the changes. But I have so much hope when I see Parasoroy, when I see Junior, when I see what is happening with new initiatives to address the lack of inclusion, diversity, and gender imbalance. And we have got to continue that because conservation is about people. 70% of our wildlife in Kenya is outside protected areas. 40% of Africa's lions are outside protected areas. We have got to bring everyone on board. And for me, that's really the take-home message that I'd like everyone to know.
And we will, thinking of just one question I'd love you to explore a little bit more. And some viewers sent in questions ahead of timing. Margie Dixon sent in one with respect to infrastructure and the tension between what she's hearing is the need for infrastructure, and Kaddu referred to it as well, you've mentioned it. And the question specifically was, please can you discuss, or, there's this tension, the balance, the impact between large scale infrastructure and wildlife conservation. Is there, who is working on that? Who is thinking about that? Because both, I'm sure we're going to hear about it going forward, but we know it's an issue, but who's on that issue?
Sure. So I'll tell you a story. I started hearing about large-scale infrastructure projects here in Northern Kenya probably about 8 years ago. I remember standing just about 50 meters away. We have a lookout looking over this amazing landscape. And I remember standing there, looking around me, looking at the river, looking at the hills, thinking, wow, one day we're going to have a train, we're going to have a power line, we're going to have a pipeline, we're going to have a highway, and it's all going to be in this landscape. And honestly, Cassandra, I was very gloomy. I was just, my head was in my hands, and I thought, well, now what? I mean, what do I do as just, what can our small project do to tackle something so big? This is a government project. It's part of what's called Vision 2030. And so what we did, and what others have done, is we've come together and we have partnered with our great friends, the Grevi Zebra Trust, and we came together to say, we can't stop this development, and we shouldn't be. Development needs to come into Africa. But what can we do with the development authorities to ensure that wildlife corridors are kept open, that communities' needs are taken into account? Because most of the time, that's completely forgotten. What can we do to keep corridors open? What can we do to ensure that livestock routes are also kept open? And the way we did it was by collaborating and bringing all the development authorities together and facilitating dialogue and bringing them here, showing them this is an important carnivore corridor. These are the communities who will be impacted by this infrastructure. So how can we work with you to ensure that these corridors are kept open and communities' needs are taken into account? And the results have been tremendous. From what filled me with so much doom and gloom many years ago, I'm actually quite excited about it now, because I can see how the development authorities are very willing to work with us. I think initially they were expecting us to just, bang on about stop the development, it's going to affect the wildlife, but that's not who we are. And through collaboration, we can work together. And just to give you one example of how it worked, the pipeline actually rerouted based on a very important Grevy's zebra breeding ground. And that for us was a huge moment of success, because it shows that we can work together, we can do what is best for wildlife, communities, and the development agencies. So yes, it's something that's still in the pipeline, so to speak. It's still all happening here, but I'm not so gloomy anymore. And I still stand out on my lookout just 50 meters away. I still see this amazing view that I've seen for so many years. And I have hope that whatever happens here, the wildlife will be okay, the communities will be okay, and the livestock will be okay.
Well, amazing. And again, Shivani, thank you so much. And I'm sure you'll see some questions in the chat you might be able to, in the Q&A, I'm sorry, to be able to answer, and we'll come back to you again later. It's a great segue, actually, talking about that, and to Shifra, who you know. Shifra, I hope you're with me in the room. Shifra, you've got you are a research fellow at San Diego Zoo Global, researching elephant behavior. I'm quite fond of elephants. I could watch them for hours. I've had the pleasure of being to a sanctuary and spending some very close time with them as well. So you research elephant behavior and ecology, and as a research ecologist at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute as well. So when we're sort of talking about behavioral ecologist, I had to sort of think, what did that really mean? And it's not that you just give thought to how animals behave, but you also give thought to how we, the humans, behave. And so I'm looking forward to what light you can share with us on this connection to nature, our responsibility, our impact, and some solutions, and of course your own personal why. But I'm really curious, given your background, to understand the role of scientific monitoring of wildlife populations, these corridors, in an endeavour to advance conservation efforts. So please, I'm desperately keen to hear some of the data and facts that sit behind this.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Cassandra. And I want to echo what everyone else has said. Thank you to all of the organizers. It's really nice to be here with you all. So there have already been such wonderful insights on different approaches to conservation shared. But I wanted to add that, when we're thinking about conservation strategies in Africa moving forward, data on wild populations, and particularly long-term data on wildlife populations, is essential. We need to know, what wildlife are doing on these landscapes, where they're going, what areas they're using, what habitat is really key, in order to be able to plan effectively. I'll give you an example from the species that I study, elephants. You put a tracking collar on an elephant and you watch them, you watch them on your screen for a few weeks, and you start to think, oh, I know what she's doing. She's really predictable. She's always going to the same watering point, and she comes back at night, and she just keeps doing this. And then, boom, the rains hit and she goes and does something completely different. And then, you follow her for another 3 or 5 years, and suddenly she goes and does this long distance movement to an ecosystem that you didn't even know she knew about. And so in order to be able to plan effectively, especially when we're thinking about infrastructure and development, we need to understand what wildlife populations need, what areas they use, and how those change over time. And so in that, I think scientific monitoring can really be a powerful tool, because it gives evidence to the people who are making decisions about wildlife in their communities. So that, I think, is an important role for data, especially long-term data. And it's very hard to maintain, but it's critical when we're thinking about how to approach conservation. You asked me about my personal why, and I have a few personal whys. One of them is about biodiversity itself. I've just always been amazed by the fact that there are so many different solutions in the world to, you know, similar problems. How do you find food? How do you find shelter? And equally, I think what's always really gripped me is that we can be so evolutionarily distant from a species, and yet we have a really similar solution. And so the familiar example that I'm sure people will appreciate is elephants, right? I mean, their sensory worlds could not be more different from those of humans. They experience the world so differently, and yet they have these incredibly strong social bonds that they rely on, that they need to survive and to navigate their landscapes. And that's just like humans. You know, we recognize when a little baby calf falls down and all her cousins run over to help her. We recognize what that is. We see that, even though we're such distant species. And so biodiversity itself is one of my whys, one reason why I do the work that I do every day. And the other source of inspiration that I get is like people on this call who are incredibly creative. I think, you know, conservationists are a group of people who are very collaborative, who have very creative solutions to problems. And so that's one of my other whys.
Can we just head back to your comment? You were obviously data and artificial intelligence. Someone did ask a question. You touched on it already a little bit, but if we could go, maybe even give an example. So Jaya said, you know, AI data science has benefited large corporations and startups. I would argue not enough, because not enough people pay attention to the data, even in large corporates, but nonetheless, they're more familiar with this concept, and these organizations are benefiting from when they use this information well. The question is, do you think AI and data science can help in providing solutions? You've obviously suggested yes. And so I might turn to the second part, which is, what are some of the ways we can use? Can you give us an example of how data sets or science, AI could be used as a solution? Make it maybe real for us.
Sure. So Shivani was just talking earlier about corridors. So if you have an understanding of how a population is using the landscape, you can identify really key areas. So she mentioned breeding habitat for Grevy's zebra, but we can also think about areas that wildlife need to move through in order to get from one place to another. And so that's a place where, in particular, GPS tracking can be used for those solutions in order to plan, for example, underpasses or overpasses, over roads or under roads where wildlife can pass through. There are a lot of examples of this working across the globe, actually. AI, so it's not my field, but I know that there's a lot of work going into AI and camera trapping. So remote camera trapping is a really important tool for wildlife conservation. You know, you set up one of these cameras, you can get them and set it up in your backyard, and they're triggered by motion. So something walks in front of it, and you see what that is. You end up, when you put that out in a wildlife conservancy or in some other area that wildlife are using, you end up with an enormous amount of images. And so AI can help to sort out at the species level, what species are you looking at? And then you can look at things like, well, what time of day are they using it? Have they changed how they're using it in response to a road being built, or in response to, you know, human activity changing in some way? And then what will be really exciting is when we can be able to distinguish individuals within species. So, you know, that's not just an elephant, but that's Martha the elephant.
All right, look, thank you for that. I know there are some more questions coming through for you as well, but I'm going to move for the moment to Andrea as well, because there's some interlinkage between the work you do and I guess, Andrea, some of the interest that, you know, when I put you side by side, for want of a better description, in this discussion, is because although you work with AWF, you have had actually other roles in the past that are international in nature. You're an economist by background. That excites me, because it proves to me that not all economists are as the stereotype suggests. We can have a soul, we can do exciting work. And importantly, I'm genuinely excited because in the way that Shifra, we can talk about the work that she's doing, that goes hand in hand with the finances. Money is key, investment, capital in better outcomes and solutions are key. And when we're hearing about, you know, 31% of the elephant population lies within protected areas, that's 69% that doesn't. I hadn't appreciated this fact. So I guess, what I'd love to hear from you, and if you could share with the audience, is what does this mean? How do we line up the economics, the capital investment, and human prosperity in a way that supports our planet and wildlife?
Thank you, Cassandra, and thank you to New Day and ESGX for the invitation to join. I've been nodding through this whole panel discussion because everything that's been said, from Amy saying the solutions are in people, to Shivani saying, look, we need to be engaging. We need to find business solutions that are different, that are innovative, that are transformative. And Shifra, in terms of how we can use data to inform those decisions, early decisions about infrastructure corridors. The Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa is a massive investment program that's planned for the continent and intersects with wildlife habitat areas across the board that need to be carefully negotiated. The way we do that is to work through land use planning processes, to engage communities and decision makers, to negotiate for space for wildlife in the context of development decisions that are taking place, and then work with businesses to create business solutions that provide livelihoods that are consistent with wildlife conservation. I was looking through the chats earlier and came across one of the questions from one of the audience members in California, who was asking about the role of women in creating a different future in terms of conservation outcomes in the continent. And that triggered in my mind a story of a woman that I worked with in Tanzania named Hilaria Pascal, who was a serial entrepreneur, for want of a better description. She was part of a basket weaving group that was a supplier into some of the tourism industry that we worked with in the northern Tanzania safari circuit. So part of the Tarangire, Manyara, Natron ecosystem that's world famous for going on the wildebeest migration in that area. And Hilaria was the kind of woman who really would take up any kind of entrepreneurship opportunity and build it from there. And within a year or two of working with her, she was winning national awards for Entrepreneur of the Year, and accessing national markets through something called the Nane Nane Festival, and was really just hungry for more. So we introduced her to another partner of ours, Solar Sister, which is a micro business opportunity for last mile distribution of solar energy solutions. And she grew her business to encompass then solar energy solution sales out to the community where she lived and worked. And in a few years' time, then went on the next thing I know, she's in New York sending me postcards from the Sustainable Energy for All event, where she's won Global Energy Woman Entrepreneur of the Year award at the Sea for All event, which is fantastic. These kinds of entrepreneurs exist in every single landscape where we work. So we look for them and invest in them in terms of skills and access to markets and capital. And here's where perhaps this audience really can make a huge difference in finding the kinds of entrepreneurs that can shape businesses that are a different kind of business, that are a green and inclusive business, to reference somebody who's spoken earlier. I think is Jane Goodall that mentioned green and inclusive businesses that create a new kind of development trajectory in landscapes across Africa that are wildlife rich landscapes, and sustain both the people and the wildlife populations at the same time. And impact investors can have a huge, can take enterprise to scale by improving the kinds of early stage support networks that entrepreneurs like Hilaria have access to, by creating soft capital that can grow enterprises into scale, and eventually grow them into stages where they can take on larger scale of capital. So whole opportunity for communities like the one around this webinar to engage with creating a better future for wildlife and people in Africa.
Thank you very much again. And again, there continue to be the questions in the Q&A. If you have a question for Andrea, we will go to Q&A shortly for everyone. We've got one more panelist that we will bring in, but please go ahead and ask. We are, as a community, very interested in what we can do and also in the solutions. And unfortunately, as with something as important as this, we do need a reminder or a shock. And we've had a little bit of that today, a bit of a wake-up call for those of us who felt we needed an extra shake, or just today we might need an extra shake and tomorrow we'll be wide awake. But it can happen to all of us where we can become complacent or something else in our life becomes temporarily more urgent. So I'm sure there'll be more questions for you shortly. And I'm just going to ask that Sean join me in the room. And I'm going to give the panelists, I'm going to cheat and let them know that I am going to be asking for you to think about because something that I care about, and I know some other people, and a question was submitted ahead of time by David Simon, they care actually about truly our connection to nature, and in high performance, what we can learn from nature. So what's one principle or lesson that you've learned from nature that when applied could lead to people operating and performing more optimally? Whether it be social, physical, work, family, leadership habits. If you can give that some thought, that's some advanced warning. But I would now like to turn to Sean, and I'm reflecting, Sean, on chimpanzees and that were made at the beginning about sharing 98% of our DNA, the way that they nurture, the way that they care. It's extraordinary. And yet elephants are known to be smart, emotional, self-aware, and highly social creatures. And to me, that sounds like a description also of human beings. And as I mentioned earlier, I do truly find the animal enchanting. I could watch them for hours. And yes, I note that there's someone in the Q&A who rightly said, spare a thought for the scaly creatures. And if we can, I'm hoping someone will go into the Q&A and answer that, because I do think the cuddly or the large creatures often get a lot of attention. And I think Raiders of the Lost Ark and other movies like that probably helped me to have an unhealthy fear of snakes. But as we're talking about the elephant cooperation where you are, I'd love to hear from someone like you with your background that is commercial and now in the conservation area. You obviously straddle both worlds and you fell in love with Africa. So can you share with us what you think the key issues or opportunities are, and what made you realize that you needed to spend more time on this issue yourself?
Well, again, thanks for inviting me, and I'm honored to be amongst a lot of people that are working hard on these issues. I'm not a conservationist. I'm a businessman that is working on that side to try to help generate money for conservation. And I got involved with this through some consulting projects for the founder of Elephant Cooperation, who believed that the old model for raising money for conservation was not ever going to generate enough to make a huge difference. So his belief is that we should be creating engines of donation that are businesses that grow and throw off their money to help save elephants and other wildlife. So that's how I got involved. And my first trip as a consultant to Africa really opened my eyes and my heart to Africa. I had not given Africa much thought. As you said earlier, Cassandra, I hadn't tuned into the channel. I'd focused most of my life here in the States and in Asia. And so this was my first opportunity to visit. And I came away with just this incredible energy, this goodwill, and this feeling that was where everything started, and that was home. And then I've since heard that's very common to feel that way when you're in Africa. And I saw what was tremendous potential, but also huge challenges. And I was asked to help friend with Elephant Cooperation. So I've been at this about a year, and very excited to be able to help. The COVID crisis has been really tough because, you know, it's really impacting people that we rely on to help elephants and other wildlife, the rangers. They're out of business basically. So it's been an interesting year. But what I'd like to share is that I think what I've learned in my year is there's a lot of plans that are, you know, central plans to solve these problems. But what I see and what I've learned in business and what I see is what works is there's a million negotiations that happen between people. And what I'd like to encourage is that people become really good at this, because it's easy to direct people to do things from a position of power. But when you can co-opt them in a solution that benefits them and achieve some of their goals and some of your goals, I think you're going to end up with progress, steady progress. And so my feeling is that we need to, as conservationists, also look at this development issue and understand that there are real reasons behind the desire to take land, farm, et cetera. And we've got to find solutions that work for both people and the animals. And this is what I heard from Kaddu when I met him a year ago, and was very excited to hear that AWF is working on finding those solutions. And the word negotiation was key to their platform. So that's really where I come from, is really trying to create business that generates money to help the cause, but also to encourage good negotiation and good deals through the process.
Absolutely vital. I don't know that you've probably had a chance to think about the question. So Sean, I'm going to give you a few moments to pause while I ask all the panelists to join me on the stage simultaneously. If we could see, I don't know if it's possible, production, to see everyone's faces, but that would be wonderful. And I have got a sore neck from nodding, and I share. I think it was you, Andrea, or someone said that they were, or it was you, Shifra, was nodding violently along. So I too have been. I'd like, you know, I popped in the Q&A for the panelists the question just so that they didn't have to remember it. But I'd like to start with, I think it's Shivani, because I know she's ready. What is that lesson, Shivani, that that we can learn as human beings from nature and apply to our own lives that might make us behave more optimally, in whether it be in a social setting, in a family, a work, a leadership role? I think yours is going to be about elephants, but I'm excited to hear. It may not be that. I know Shifra's got one about that, but what's your lesson, Shivani?
So mine is about lions. Watching lions and seeing how focused and driven they are on a certain goal. So often for them it's hunting, and they're just in the moment. And I think that's something we can learn from lions, is being present in the moment. It's something I have to really work on a lot, but it's something that helps me as I go forward. And I wanted to add one more. Watching Samburu, you know, seeing the changes in Samburu over the last 2 decades, seeing Samburu being, you know, exposed to frequent droughts, frequent floods, diseases, locust invasions, and now COVID. It is a landscape that has been battered so many times, but it is a landscape that is so strong and so resilient. And for me, that's something I see all the time. I just look at it and I think, wow, 6 months ago, there was the worst drought ever. And now look, it's bounced back. So for me, I think it's those two. It's about being in the moment, being present, and resilience.
Wow, what a fantastic lesson. Shifra, I believe you are good to go too with your answer.
Sure. So I'll show my elephant bias. I have a few lessons. One is communicate often. The other is listen to your elders. They know, they've been around the block. And then the third is build strong social support networks.
I'm going to go to you, Kaddu. You've had a chance to have a rest.
Thank you. It's a great question. I think for me, it's really the respect to the ecosystem. It's amazing when you are out there in the wild and you see lions take out only what they need that evening, or elephants. In a country like Botswana with over 180,000 elephants, a country the size of less than New Hampshire, but able to live there sustainably with so little, but only taking what they need. That less greed is amazing with wildlife.
Thank you very much. Are you ready, Andrea, to go?
Sure, yeah. One species is difficult to focus on with this question. To me, what I've learned is the importance of diversity, in fact. And I'm a gardener, and I love pollinators as a gardener. And every flower, every vegetable has its pollinator, and we need them all in order to have the harvest. And so I'm constantly battling with my kids who are fighting against wasps or bees or things that they think don't have a role in the system, to really make them aware about the importance of keeping the whole intact.
A very, very powerful lesson. I've spent a few days watching bees on flowers. Just still find that mesmerizing. And I just standing for long enough and close enough that another bug came along at the same time, and I watched them coexist on the same petals. And fascinating how one got on with what it needed to do and didn't interrupt the other. And truly extraordinary to learn about animals, small and large, scaly and furry, to that original question. So thank you very much for the gardeners that are listening. A very powerful message there. Sean, have you had chance now to give it some thought?
I have. I would say the lesson I'd like to convey is to connect children to animals early. And I'm sitting here now, there are 16 kids. We have a little hobby farm that I live on that are at a day camp playing with chickens and geese and pigs, etc. And when you watch children interact with animals, they become more gentle. They see that, you know, there's more to life than the video games and screens that they're on. And I think the more we can do that, and the more we can educate children about animals, the future will be much brighter. Beautiful.
I'm going to turn now to Kaddu to give a few of his comments. He's listened, and one question I'd love you to answer if you can give us another few minutes of your time, Kaddu, would be, how are African governments going to feed and educate a population that in the next 30 years? There is a constant theme here that's been with a couple of people in the Q&A that's really been about, as much as we talk about the wonderful things we can do, we really are racing against an increasing population who deserve not to be poor, who deserve infrastructure. So how do we deserve the environment whilst at the same time meeting human needs for what is perceived to be prosperity, and which so many of us on this call take for granted, but should be more evenly distributed and accessed?
Yeah, in our work, we've actually been talking to a number of governments to address that issue. Andrea touched up a little bit about it. It's really looking at land use and looking at conservation, what we care about, as one of the land uses, and seeing planning land as with a multitude of use that support each other in the same ecosystem. It's really trying to demonstrate how the dependence of agriculture to forests, the dependence of cities to the water sources that are found in national parks, and the system that maintains this ecological infrastructure, as we call it now, that absolutely necessary. With that conversation, there is a realization of finding the balance with those ecosystem that supports the needs of especially food security and food production. We are getting there. There's a number of organizations that are trying to develop models for agriculture. We are involved in some of that work. But it's a tall order. The conversations with some of the leaders of the continent is really the priorities and the pressure they're faced with the young population that is demanding for other priorities. And that's where we really need to change the way we work and be very inclusive, as a number of panelists have said. But you know, with what other things that this discussion has shown us is really that it's going to take all of us. It's going to be those small individual steps each of us can afford to create this mass or a level of economies of scale. It comes from the individual actions. And some of us touched on the Africa, the history, the culture, you know, that needs to be looked at. Some panelists talked about the African traditional cultures that teaches us a lot on the relationships that used to happen with nature. But it came from the resource use. Nature was medicine. Sometimes it was religion. It was shelter. It was a fraternity, which still exists in many cases with tribal clans. It's what brings you together. It's sustainable food as a food source. So it's a very communal sense that happened in Africa. The challenge today is really how that modern Africa needs to look like. 60% are young people. And I think some of the great examples we had this evening and hope was coming from answering how we can afford this population with basic economic opportunities tied to the unique resources they have in order to act as responsible stewards. That is the responsibility we have. There is hope from what we've had today, and we know nothing is impossible when we all come together. I thank you all very much for our evening, and thanks, Cassandra, for a great job this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, and we could honestly go on. I think it's a testament to everyone. We had 350 odd registrations. Most people turned up live in whether YouTube or here. Most people stayed on beyond 1.5 hours. So I'm breathless. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. 3, apparently that's about a number we can remember. And I'm going to start with love. I've long talked about love and its role in decision making. I've been known for taking love on the road and into the boardroom. And Dr. Jane Goodall makes reference to our hearts and minds as well in her opening video. She questions how such an intellectual species as ourselves can be destroying our planet. And she suggests there is a disconnect between our clever brain and our human heart, our love and our compassion. And I ask you to sit with that. So because like her, I believe it's when the heart and the mind work together, one informing the other, that we can achieve full human potential. So much of the time I'm speaking to leaders and I'm saying, dial down the thinking and dial up the feeling. And for it to really be able to want to go in and solve some of these problems, you need to be really, really connected to your heart as well as your mind. Secondly, what is the opportunity? In the video, again, she talks about the threat and the opportunity. And either of these outcomes is almost entirely driven by us, the humans. And so I'm hoping that today we've heard where some of the opportunities lie for our own survival, well-being and health. And hope that we can, hope is one of those things, I guess I also talk about it. It can be dangerous when it's false hope. But what Kaddu has just said and what other presenters have said is there is hope. And the very best of human spirit can be harnessed And we can find the solutions that we need. Technology exists, financing exists, but we need the will, and we need something, a sense of urgency. And it's going to take something, and that'll lead to my third point, and that's perhaps the hardest of all, and that is change. We need not just to consider, not only rethink, but to actually change, and I suggest transform. We need to be willing to redefine success, which I could not agree with more. We need to redefine what is it to be prosperous, and to come up with a destination for our lives, for our society and our planet, that makes space for greater harmony for all living beings, plants and animals. And this is, in my opinion, perhaps the hardest, because this means changing our behaviors, changing our normals that have superficially seemed to have served us well, moving perhaps towards a less consumerist and more sustainable behavior and outlook, engaging in more generous acts, doing, accepting that we might have to do more with less. So to use the quote from the opening of the video from Gandhi, this planet can provide for human need, not human greed. And as you said, Kaddu, it will take all of us to change the trajectory we're on. It will take all of us to embrace the amazing opportunity that we have to find a much more sustainable future for this magnificent planet and the beautiful human beings that live on it. So thank you so much to the audience for making it possible. Thank you to the beautiful panelists, speakers, presenters, all for your storytelling, for your heart, for your courage every day to go out and do this largely as your full-time role. For those of us that have other jobs, I'm sure that we can each find ways that we can participate to making a difference. So I'll hand over to you now, Doug. Thank you.
Great, Cassandra, thank you very much. I'd like to express my gratitude to the leaders that joined us today from around the world so that we can share their experiences and learn how we as individuals and institutions can make a difference as we protect our world in the face of massive change. I am so incredibly inspired by the work that these individuals and professionals are doing in the field. Over the course of the past few years, I've had many who have asked us at New Day why we do this work that we do in wildlife conservation and animal welfare. Protecting those that oftentimes cannot protect themselves is fundamental to our responsibilities that we have as human beings. New Day, with our partners at HIP Investor, Pottinger, and ESGX, is informed on the transformational change that improves our world for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. And through education and providing opportunities to direct investment capital and charitable capital to these important causes like wildlife conservation and animal welfare, we are trying to do our part. But this work isn't exclusive to New Day, our partners, nor the distinguished leaders from the organizations that joined us today. We can all participate in this really important cause. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be a conservationist. You can be an educator, you can be an engineer, a farmer, or even an investor. Anyone can make a real contribution to conservation. And we take this work incredibly seriously, and we've spent thousands of hours researching public companies that support wildlife conservation and animal welfare. These companies are available in the New Day Wildlife Conservation Investment Fund, and I'm really pleased to announce that initiating with this event today, we are going to begin supporting the work of the Jane Goodall Institute, the African Wildlife Foundation, Owasso Alliance, through their work at Wildlife Conservation Network and the San Diego Zoo. We will be contributing a percentage of our revenues from our Wildlife Conservation and Animal Welfare Investment Fund to these incredible organizations so that they can continue to do the deep impact work that they and only they can do. So Cassandra, can't thank you enough for brilliant moderation today and all of the speakers that contributed to making today's session what was incredibly important as we strike out to all individually become conservationists. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doug. And thanks to all of you for joining in on ESGX. I want to thank again Jane Goodall, as well as Kaddu Sebunya of the African Wildlife Federation, and Andrea Athenas from African Wildlife Foundation, Shivani Bala from Iwaso Lions, Amy Vitale of National Geographic, Shifra Goldenberg of San Diego Zoo Global, and Sean Sugarman of Elephant Cooperation. There's a wonderful global view and systems-wide view of the challenges, but also of the solutions that we can all pursue. And consistent with what we do at ESGX, we seek to educate, which hopefully you've learned something today that you can not only know, but also share. Talk about at your dinner table, talk about on your other Zooms with your business colleagues, friends, and family. That you could be inspired to do more, to take your business focus, your social focus, your citizen focus, and to do more. And I think of myself as a citizen of the world, having been to 60 plus countries, including several in Africa. And I'm really excited every time we have conversations like these for action. And that's the most important thing, to be educated, to be inspired, and to take action. If you like this episode of ESGX, please feel free to share it with your friends and on social media. This is we have weekly episodes, and sometimes we even have multi-weekly episodes, like during Earth Week of this year, which Doug Heskey and New Day Impact Investing help organize, along with my co-host Nigel Lake of Pottinger. Thanks very much to Cassandra for moderating and curating the conversation today. And of course, thanks to Nick Gower, our air traffic controller and producer, who makes everything run smoothly. Next week on ESGX, we're going to focus on defending our cities from items like climate change, river overflows, and other weather events, to build infrastructure like sustainable neighborhoods. And we'll also touch on muni bonds and other financing and funding mechanisms that can help this, as well as actions that you can take in policy. And having worked with Nick Gower and I, having worked with almost 24 cities, they're action-oriented people in every city around the country and around the world, to help make sustainability policy as well as sustainability implementation. And that will be moderated by Lucia Pullman, who's a client finance strategist. So thanks again for joining today. The ESGX episode will be available for replay on esgx.org. So please look for it there, share it around on social media. And thanks for being educated, informed, and called to action. We can all make the world a better place. We'll look forward to seeing you next time on ESGX, and we have a wrap-up video to send everybody off with.